Hi, my name is JJ, and I'm working on a project called Philosophy Matters, Philosophy and the Good Life. Basically, what I'm trying to do is look at how philosophy can really impact our day-to-day lives. And I think one of the most important ways to do this is looking at how we can live what some might consider a good life. In order to start doing this, I first am going to discuss the spirit and pursuit of philosophy. Philosophy literally means love of wisdom, and it got started in ancient Greece, at least Western philosophy did, with what we might now even call naturalistic science. It started asking questions. What is it? What is around us? How do things work? From there, it developed into this very dialectic method. Socrates was one of the most famous early philosophers, and he thrived by asking these types of questions. He really explored what it meant to be alive, and he focused more on ethics than the natural scientific view of earlier ethics. And he did this by walking around and questioning people, asking questions of them. Many people saw him as a pest, as a gadfly, but he really started this idea of the dialectic method of asking questions in order to think about life. And that's a method that is important to me and something I use when I'm thinking through these types of questions. In talking about the good life, one of the challenges is discussing happiness. There are a lot of problems when you start talking about happiness and the good life and how you're going to think about them. One in particular that I'll just mention briefly, we can talk about Robert Nozick's experience machine. This is a thought experiment, and he says, hey, if you could be hooked up to a machine that gave you pleasurable experiences, so basically you could choose whatever lifestyle you want. You could be a rock star, or you could be a doctor, anything you pick. You could be hooked up and not even know you were hooked up once you're hooked up. Would you choose to do this? One of the things that's interesting about this is a lot of people would say no, because they wouldn't actually be achieving anything. So even if they didn't realize they weren't achieving anything, in the real world, they would think they were not. So they would choose not to be hooked up to this machine. So when we start talking about pleasure and happiness and how those relate, this kind of thought experience can maybe help us think through that a little bit. What really matters? Is it simply pleasure, or is it some type of achievement in the quote unquote real world? That's just one example of how things can get difficult when you're discussing a topic like this. Next, I would look at external theories of happiness, and some of the examples are hedonism, Epicureanism, and utilitarianism. What's interesting about these theories in particular is that some of them have almost become parodies of what they were originally meant to be. So, for example, when you hear Epicurus or Epicureanism today, you probably get this image of overindulging on food and probably like booze and beer and wine, and you just get this image of overindulgence. When really Epicurus himself thought we should find pleasures in simple things like a glass of water, and really that we're confused about what makes us happy. So although we should focus on pleasure, for Epicurus in particular at least, avoiding pain was possibly more important, and overindulging would be a form of pain for him. So we're going to look at several different theories of happiness from an external perspective. The other side of that are internal theories of happiness, two common examples being Stoicism and Buddhism. Stoicism would also include Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. Um, Both of these basically suggest that rather than changing what's going on outside of us, we have to look inside ourselves. What shall be. Our flourishing, our good life depends entirely upon our own character and these internal factors rather than what's going on around us. And this is a big contrast to the external theories. And so that's something that we'll look much more in depth towards. The next thing to look at would be positive psychology and the science of happiness. In the past 1 to 2 decades, this has really become more prominent in research, and scientists and psychologists have been looking at it, and a lot of philosophers have started dealing with it more as well. Um, the goal is to use experimentation to answer questions about human happiness. What is it that makes us happy? Can we actually affect this level of happiness? And so what I'll do is take a look at some of these experiments and then compare them to the internal-external debate on the good life. Um, and kind of see if that brings any light to these ancient Greek discussions. Does modern research have anything to say? Can it answer the age-old debate? What has the research shown us so far, and what questions might be left to answer? The next thing that I want to consider is virtue and happiness, and really look at the Aristotelian concept of the good life. He said that the good life is achieving eudaimonia, and in general, this is something that is probably, it gets translated as happiness, but it's probably something much more long lasting than what we typically think of as happiness. Maybe something like joy would be a better interpretation of that. How does virtue relate to achieving that good life? What role does it play? Why does it matter? Let's take an in-depth look at what that good life is for Aristotle, and also how wisdom plays into that. Then, just to make sure we're hitting all sides, I will take a look at pessimism and melancholy. Some people suggest that, especially in America, there's an overemphasis on being happy, and these sort of self-help and positive psychology type publications that keep getting put out are really preventing us from living the good life. Um, One work in particular, Against Happiness, strongly argues that melancholy is something that's really important for creativity. So I'm going to look at those arguments and see and ask at least the question, are we looking too strongly at happiness? Are there more important things? Is there something else we should be focused on? Could happiness actually be a roadblock to achieving the good life? And through that, we'll also look at Schopenhauer's pessimism. Next, I will delve into the way that modern media affects our happiness and the ability to achieve the good life. Um, Neil Postman, Amusing Ourselves to Death, wrote a lot about that. There's a documentary called Advertising and the End of the World. The amount of media that we consume really, I think, is the biggest key in this. Most Americans spend about 25% of their waking day watching television, and some of them watch more television than a full-time job would be. So that's approaching 40 hours a week of watching television. What this means is that the number of advertisements we encounter also increases. So we see over 3,000 ads per day through TV, through billboards on our phones, browsing the web. We see more ads than ever. So these advertisements affect us, but also just watching television affects us. One of the kind of studies that stands out most in the research I've done is that people who watch more news, regardless of what station, actually understand less what's going on in the world. So I'll take an in-depth look at how that happens and what the relationship is. Finally, to sort of sum everything up, what I want to do is reflect heavily on the meaning of life by thinking about death. Really pausing and reflecting on what death means, what we feel about death, what we believe happens after death, if anything, and what that can tell us about how we might ought to live our lives. Um, can our thoughts on death inform the way we live our lives? Leo Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Ilyich is really powerful in this sense. Um, there's It's easy to know that all men are mortal, and that's a very intellectual understanding. But in this novella by Tolstoy, we really get to see an existential understanding of that. Whether all men die, we think about I will die, and looking at it that way can really have more impact on the way we look at life. So I'd want to explore that in depth. Anyway, I am working on this project, and I'd really appreciate if you would click over to philosophymatters.org to learn a little bit more about it, and hopefully support my Kickstarter project as well. I'm trying to raise some money to put out an interactive book about these topics, and any help you can give, I would really appreciate it. Thank you.